Hi class, in this recording we're going to talk about how we move oxygen gas and carbon dioxide gas around in the bloodstream, and then gas exchange with the systemic or tissues of the body, and then also pulmonary or alveolar gas exchange across that membrane in the lungs. So as we look at transporting gases in the bodies, our body, we need to move gas from point A to point B. We need to get gas from the alveoli to the tissues of the body, and then take gases from the tissues of the body and send them back to the alveoli. When we look at oxygen, we need to move oxygen from the alveoli of the lungs to the tissues of the body. And overwhelmingly, that oxygen is going to be bound to the hemoglobin molecules within our red blood cells or erythrocytes. We also have a small amount of oxygen gas, a percentage of oxygen gas dissolved in the blood plasma. And then when we look at carbon dioxide, overwhelmingly, carbon dioxide is going to have a water molecule added to it to make it into carbonic acid, and that carbonic acid will then turn into a bicarbonate ion. So the vast majority of carbon dioxide is ultimately transported in our bloodstream as a bicarbonate ion. And that's a good thing, because if it was transported as just carbon dioxide itself being dissolved in the plasma, we would have carbonated blood that would be really fizzy and bubbly, and we'd die very quickly from having bubbles in our bloodstream. So, woohoo! We convert it to carbonic acid, and then it dissociates to bicarbonate ions. A small amount of carbon dioxide will also be bound to proteins in our bloodstream, but I'm really wanting to emphasize here for you, it's going to mostly be moved as a bicarbonate ion. So let's look at oxygen first. Each red blood cell is going to have millions of hemoglobin molecules. And this will allow for the blood in our arteries that has just left the lungs to have about 20 milliliters of oxygen gas for every deciliter of blood. And as we look at the hemoglobin molecule, an adult hemoglobin molecule is made of 2 alpha subunits and 2 beta subunits. And those 4 globular subunits, the 2 alphas and 2 betas, are each going to have a heme group in them. In the center of that heme group, we have one iron atom. And that one iron atom in the center of the heme group makes our blood red, and it's also going to be where we bind an O2 molecule. So 2 oxygen atoms double bonded together will bind to that one iron atom. So as we look at one hemoglobin, because that one hemoglobin has 4 hemes, one hemoglobin can ultimately transport 4 oxygen molecules. When we have oxygen bound to heme, we refer to it as oxyhemoglobin. And when the oxygen has been dissociated from it, we call it an H hemoglobin, because a hydrogen ion, an H plus 1, sometimes referred to as a hydronium ion, has been attached to that iron atom instead of the oxygen molecule. As we look at carbon dioxide, it's going to be transported in 3 primary forms. The carbonic acid that is dissociated into bicarbonate ions. We have carbonoamino compounds, aka bound to protein. So when we say carbonoamino, think of amino acids that make up protein molecules. Our carbonamino compound is a carbon dioxide bound to a protein, or the carbon dioxide can just be dissolved in the blood plasma directly. Most carbon dioxide is going to be turned into that carbonic acid. And when we say hydrated, we mean add a water molecule. So if we take CO2 plus water, it turns to H2CO3, carbonic acid. And then carbonic acid is in an aqueous solution and will instantaneously dissociate to a bicarbonate ion plus a hydronium ion or hydrogen ion. You should commit this chemical equation to memory. It's a key equation, which is why I made it red. And then as we look at the 5% that is bound to proteins, it's going to that carbon dioxide will bind to the amino groups of blood plasma proteins and or hemoglobins themselves. If the carbon dioxide binds to hemoglobin, we call it carbaminohemoglobin, which is abbreviated HbCO2. Carbaminohemoglobin, it's kind of a tongue twister. HbCO2 is a little bit easier to say. And this is carbon dioxide that is not going to compete with oxygen. It can bind to different parts of the hemoglobin molecule. So when we say moiety, that just means a different functional group on the hemoglobin. So hemoglobin can transport oxygen gas and carbon dioxide gas at the same time. The same individual hemoglobin can transport both gases at the same time because they bind to different locations on that molecule. Now, as we look at carbon monoxide, carbon monoxide is abbreviated CO because it only has one oxygen. And carbon monoxide, it will competitively compete with oxygen to bind to iron on the hemoglobin. This is known as competitive inhibition. It's kind of like when you and your friends call shotgun. Somebody calls shotgun, and then they run up and jump into the front passenger seat of the car, the best seat in the car. You're all competing to sit in that front passenger seat. And we can think of carbon monoxide as competing with oxygen to attach itself to the iron of the hemoglobin. And this is a problem because carbon dioxide will always win. And if carbon dioxide binds to the iron of the hemoglobin, that means that hemoglobin molecule is not able to transport oxygen gas. Carboxyhemoglobin is when carbon dioxide is bound to hemoglobin. And this is bad because carbon dioxide doesn't let go. And it's a problem because carbon dioxide is colorless, it's odorless, it's very hard to find. And I have a side story I want to share with you. I remember a house I used to own had a carbon monoxide detector, and it was a networked carbon monoxide detector in the whole house. So we had 8 sensors, and if one went off, they all went off. And I remember one morning, my carbon monoxide detectors went off, and it was the middle of the night. It was 3 a.m. in the morning, and I woke up, and I heard beep, 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 carbon monoxide detected, beep, 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 carbon monoxide detected. And I remember thinking to myself, great. Now what? I have a little kid. My baby's asleep in the crib. My wife and I are both dreary-eyed. We're like, what the heck is going on here? So I walk down to the basement. I check the furnace. The furnace isn't running because it's the middle of the summer. Good. I check the water heater. There's no flame in the water heater. I check my gas stove. No flames in the gas stove. There's literally nothing I can find in my house that's burning, that can be producing carbon monoxide to trip the alarms off. And I'm so tired and I'm so confused and groggy. I just have no idea what's going on. And then I remember a symptom of carbon monoxide poisoning is that you are confused and lethargic, which makes sense because if you are displacing oxygen from your blood, your brain has reduced oxygen flow, and then you become confused and lethargic as less oxygen goes to your brain. So picture this, it's 3 a.m. in the morning, and all of a sudden, you're hearing something say, beep at you, saying you're being poisoned by carbon monoxide, but anything in the house that would make carbon monoxide is turned off and not generating a flame, but then you're confused and groggy. So are you being poisoned with carbon monoxide because you're confused and groggy? Or I should say, are you confused and groggy because you're being poisoned by carbon monoxide? Or are you confused and groggy because it's 3 a.m. in the morning and this alarm is beeping at you? Well, for me personally in this situation, I decided to split the difference. I unplugged the alarms and I opened all the windows in my house and went back to bed. And as it turns out, I later figured out that the warranty, like the alarms had gone bad and I got them replaced by warranty, thankfully. And yeah, that's that. As we look at this carbon dioxide, it's going to bind so tightly to your hemoglobin that even post-mortem, it will still be stuck to your hemoglobin. And here's the key clue to look for. If you see bright red patches of bright red blood in a body that's post-mortem, and that the bright red blood is on the surface or the superior side of the cadaver, not on the inferior side, that's a giant red flag that that individual passed away because of carbon monoxide poisoning. So let's talk about gas exchange with the systemic circuit, or the systemic gas exchange. We need to get oxygen gas to the tissues, and we need to remove carbon dioxide gas from the tissues. So we're first going to load carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is shown right here with the biggest arrow because this is how most carbon dioxide is processed. That carbon dioxide is going to go from the tissues of our body to the blood plasma and then into the red blood cell itself. And within the red blood cell, the carbon dioxide is going to attach itself to water, and the chemical reaction is going to be catalyzed by an enzyme called carbonic anhydrase. And that carbonic anhydrase in the bloodstream will take CO2 plus H2O and speed up the conversion of it to carbonic acid. So CaH right here over the arrow represents carbonic anhydrase. So it just speeds up the chemical reaction regardless of whatever direction it's going. And then the carbonic acid turns into a bicarbonate ion and a hydrogen ion. So we have CO2 plus H2O yields H2CO3, yields HCO3 with a -1 plus H plus 1. Now we need to get that bicarbonate out of the cell, out of the red blood cell into the bloodstream. To get that bicarbonate ion into the blood plasma, we take a -1 bicarbonate, dump it into the blood plasma, and trade it with a -1 chloride ion and pull it back into the cell. So we exchange a -1 ion for a -1 ion, and we maintain membrane voltage throughout this process. This flip-flop of chloride ions and bicarbonate ions is known as the chloride shift, as we shift chloride ions across the membrane to get bicarbonate out of the erythrocyte. And in terms of oxygen unloading, as we have oxygen removed from a hemoglobin molecule, the oxygen will be replaced with a hydrogen ion. And as the hydrogen ions bind to the hemoglobin molecule, hemoglobin has a reduced affinity for oxygen. In other words, as we lose oxygen from a hemoglobin molecule, we are more likely to lose more oxygen from that hemoglobin molecule. In other words, it causes the hemoglobin to hang on to the oxygen, and the moment that once that hemoglobin gets to where we need it, it will rapidly release all the oxygen at the target tissue. So as we look at the amount of oxygenated hemoglobin at the alveolar capillaries, we are at near 100% saturation. We'll say close to 97% saturation. And then as we have it as it arrives at the systemic capillaries, it's around 97% saturated. And when it leaves the systemic capillaries, it is 75% saturated. So here is the concentration of oxygen in the blood when it arrives at the tissues of the systemic body. And here's the concentration of oxygen in the blood as the hemoglobin leaves that capillary bed. And we typically will lose about 22% of the oxygen from our blood with one pass through a capillary bed. And this means that we're always going to have reserve oxygen in our bloodstream. Approximately 78% of our oxygen in our bloodstream at any given point in time is going to be within the veins, the venous circuit. So we're always going to have some reserve oxygen left over in case we have to hold our breath for a really long time. And that's a good thing. As we look at gas exchange at the alveola, for CO2 unloading, we need to get CO2 out of the bloodstream. So we have lots of carbonate ions, HCO3s, the -1 charge, floating around in the blood plasma. And we'll take that HCO3 and dump it back into the erythrocyte with a reverse chloride shift. And as we put the bicarbonate back into the erythrocyte, the chloride ions are going to leave the erythrocyte. And now we'll have bicarbonate ions and hydrogen ions in the erythrocyte. They reassociate to make carbonic acid. And based on the concentration gradients, because we have a very low concentration of CO2, low CO2 concentrations in the alveolar air, that carbonic anhydrase moves the chemical reaction this way to turn carbonic acid into carbon dioxide, and then that carbon dioxide goes into the alveolar air and we will exhale it. So we have the same chemical reaction, but it's been reversed. So the arrows are pointing to the left this time. Now we can, I think I might have gone too many slides here. Let me back up a slide. Yeah, I wanted to stop on this slide. So we're going to stop our recording right here. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to post them in the class discussion board or shoot me an email. And as always, happy studies.